The air tasted like hot copper and pulverized limestone. Doc Callahan, 20 years old, but looking 50 in the flickering afternoon light filtered through the shredded canopy, pressed his cheek against the slick, red mud of the bomb crater. 30 minutes had passed since the last fusillade of AK fire had stitched the surrounding jungle, and the transition from shattering violence to absolute, pressurized silence was physically painful. It was the silence of anticipation, the jungle holding its breath, waiting for the Americans to expose themselves or the NVA to launch the final, punishing counterattack. Callahan was in the eye of the psychological storm, trapped in a depression barely large enough for himself and his two most critical patients, PFC Ruiz and Sergeant Vance. Ruiz lay nearest the rim, his breath bubbling shallowly through a makeshift chest seal, a sucking chest wound that was fighting to win. Vance, partially shielded by the crater's lip, was conscious, cursing softly, his lower body numb after shrapnel had kissed his spine. Their predicament was simple. They were stranded on Hill 900, deep behind where the line should have been, and extraction, if it came at all, was estimated at 15 agonizing minutes away. 15 minutes was an eternity when life was measured in heartbeats, and the slightest shift in the jungle foliage meant imminent death. Callahan's hands were stained black with dried blood and mud, moving with the practiced urgency of survival, not protocol. He had stabilized Ruiz just enough to keep the oxygen flowing, but the pressure inside the young man's chest was building again, a ticking clock threatening immediate collapse. Callahan gripped the thin foil wrapper of a decompression needle, its sterile promise mocking the filth of the environment. Every muscle in his body screamed to move, to stand up, to clear the line of sight and confirm the enemy's absence. But the fear of drawing a single, aimed shot kept him anchored. The weight of the two men's lives felt like physical lead on his back. He leaned in close to Ruiz, whose eyes were fluttered shut, his lips moving soundlessly. Callahan thought of his training, the pristine white sheets of the hospital simulations, and the clinical separation from death. Here, death was a humid, tactile thing, breathing down his neck. He checked the pulse one more time, his fingers shaking not from fear, but from the unbearable necessity of remaining still. He knew that the waiting, the silent, invisible pressure was designed to break them before the enemy even moved again. The immediate danger had ceased, but the deadly wait had only just begun, promising a slow, agonizing disintegration of their sanity and their physical defenses. The intense, metallic scent of ozone and cordite lingered, a ghostly reminder of the fury they had just survived, making the current lack of sound feel like a trick, a cruel joke played by the landscape itself. Callahan checked the plasma bag hanging precariously from an upturned rifle stock. It was dripping too slowly, a frustrating, meticulous process in a world demanding instant miracles. He whispered the estimated time remaining. 14 minutes, Ruiz. Just hold tight. Callahan mentally divided the remaining time into 90-second increments, the maximum duration he could allow himself to focus solely on the patients without scanning the immediate perimeter. The captain, before falling silent 200 yards away, had only provided a rough estimate of 15 minutes for the Hueys to arrive from the nearest secured firebase, conditional on the weather holding and the designated LZ not being zeroed by mortar fire. Now, halfway through the first minute, the gravity of that loose time frame settled over Callahan like a shroud. He focused entirely on Ruiz's chest, noting the paradoxical tautness of the skin around the dressing, a clear sign that the air pressure was increasing, threatening to crush the lung. The waiting demanded immobility, but survival required immediate, precise action. Callahan had to perform a needle thoracostomy, a procedure so invasive and risky that in training, it was only reserved for definitive terminal emergencies. Here, under the watchful, invisible eyes of the VC entrenched somewhere in the jungle thicket, it felt like signing a death warrant for both of them. He needed absolute silence and focus, but every jungle sound was amplified tenfold. The relentless buzz of fat flies drawn to the fresh blood, the drip-drip of condensation falling from the shredded leaves above, and the wet, shallow sounds of Ruiz fighting for air. He pulled the large-bore needle and catheter from its packaging, the plastic crinkling like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. Vance, eyes fixed on the sky but seeing nothing, managed a rasping sound. "Doc, if you do that, you gotta do it right. No second chances for the long sun." Callahan nodded, recognizing the sergeant's fear masking itself as advice. Vance, despite his paralysis, had become Callahan's secondary nervous system, a sentinel for the unseen. The duality was agonizing. The clinical, detailed focus required to save Ruiz's life, juxtaposed against the primal, overriding need to survive the ambush they knew was coming. Callahan checked his watch again, 13 minutes remaining. The minutes were not passing. They were accumulating, weighting the atmosphere, making the air too thick to breathe. He wiped the sweat from his brow, smearing blood into his hairline, and carefully palpated the intercostal space. He had to penetrate precisely at the second rib, mid-clavicular line. A millimeter off, and he risked piercing the heart or the great vessels. The waiting wasn't just delaying rescue. It was actively destroying his composure, introducing tiny, fatal hesitations into his movements. He whispered an apology to Ruiz, feeling the profound isolation of his responsibility. No one else in this crater could stop the physiological process that was killing the boy. He took a single, deep breath, ignoring the metallic tang of fear and concentrating only on the feel of the rib cage beneath his fingertips. The metallic clink of the needle striking the rib before sliding over it and plunging into the pleural cavity sounded deafening in the silence. It was immediately followed by a distinct, pressurized hiss, the sound of trapped air rushing out, a sound infinitely more reassuring than the previous bubbling. Ruiz's chest visibly eased, and his breathing, though still shallow, gained a necessary rhythm. Callahan watched the clear plastic catheter, momentarily relieved of its lethal potential, now a fragile lifeline. He secured the line with tape, his body trembling from the sudden release of internal tension. But the respite lasted barely 5 seconds before the waiting resumed its grip. This time, the silence was shattered by a different kind of sound, the snap of dried bamboo breaking, maybe 50 feet away, somewhere beyond the perimeter wire that Captain Hayes' men had hastily strung before the fighting erupted. Callahan froze, his hand instinctively dropping toward the M16 he had placed beside his thigh. His dilemma flared again, medic or soldier. He was carrying 2 critically wounded men. If he engaged, he risked exposing the crater completely. If he ignored it, the movement might signal the beginning of the full-scale counterattack. Vance, despite his debilitating injury, tracked the sound with his eyes. Not a monkey, document too slow, too deliberate. Vance's voice was a low, guttural warning, confirming Callahan's worst fear. The VC was probing the perimeter, likely confirming the soft spots before deployment. Callahan carefully picked up his rifle, placing it across his chest, keeping his eyes on Ruiz, who had stabilized for the moment. The duality of his role demanded that he simultaneously guard the lives within the crater and the perimeter outside it. He hated the waiting, the game of cat and mouse where the enemy held all the cards, choosing the time and place of contact. He gripped the rifle tighter, his gaze fixed on the dense tangle of triple canopy jungle, searching for the telltale shimmer of a black uniform or the glint of steel. He could taste the adrenaline flooding his system, preparing him for a confrontation that might never materialize, which was precisely the enemy's goal: psychological attrition. He had to be ready to transition from surgeon to executioner in a heartbeat. The minutes crawled. 12 minutes left. The sun shifted slightly, casting a sharp shadow across the lip of the crater, temporarily blinding him to the suspicious area near the broken bamboo. He shifted his weight minutely, trying to regain his view, cursing the unforgiving terrain and the heat that baked the air around them. The silence was so perfect, so complete, that Callahan felt he could hear his own heartbeat reverberating off the crater walls. He remembered reading that intense silence could cause auditory hallucinations. He He strained to differentiate between actual threats and the paranoia setting in. The next 5 minutes, he knew, would be purely psychological warfare, played out in the oppressive quiet of the jungle floor, with every rustle of leaves being a potential signal of doom. Vance coughed, a dry, rattling sound that seemed inappropriately loud. He shifted his weight, wincing as the movement sent lightning bolts of pain through his upper torso. Don't waste your eyes out there, document. If they move fast. You need to save the kid, Vance whispered, his voice laced with the heavy resignation of a man who believed his fight was over. Callahan glanced at Vance, noticing the pallor beneath the grime. Vance was slipping into shock, prioritizing Ruiz's slim chance of survival over his own desperate medical needs. Sarge, I need to check the dressing, Callahan replied, his voice deliberately sterile, refusing to engage in the emotional battle. Vance shook his head slowly. My legs are gone. That's a fact. Ruiz has a chance to walk out of here. You focus on the living, Callahan. That's your mandate. This was the insidious reality of the wait. The moral negotiation that happens when resources, time, attention, medical supplies are critically scarce. Callahan knew Vance needed immediate stabilization for the spinal injury, immobilization, heavy pain management, but moving him risked aggravating the wound and accelerating the shock. More importantly, Vance's condition required intense focus. Focus that Ruiz could not afford to lose. The medic's internal clock was a cruel mistress, demanding constant recalculation of triage protocols. Vance's sacrifice, while noble, was also terrifying. It left Callahan entirely alone in the decision-making process, facing the impossible choice between two dying men. Callahan reached for his morphine syringe, injecting a small dose into Vance's arm, ignoring the protests. You're not making decisions yet, Sarge. You're my eyes. I need you lucid, not comfortable. The deliberate lie was necessary. He needed Vance's tactical experience, the ingrained wariness that came from years in the field. But the injection served two purposes: pain relief and keeping Vance functional just long enough to maintain his vigilance. 11 minutes remaining. The air was becoming heavier, thick with humidity that promised a late afternoon downpour, which would be disastrous for the LZ. A low-frequency hum, almost felt rather than heard, began to resonate through the soil, the distant sound of heavy artillery fire, far to the west. It wasn't directed at them, but the sound reminded them that they were an isolated island in a sea of continuous, invisible war. The knowledge that the battle continued elsewhere only emphasized their own desperate vulnerability. Callahan turned back to Ruiz, checking the chest seal again. The waiting forced him into meticulous, repetitive acts, a desperate attempt to impose order onto total chaos. He cleaned away some of the dried blood around Ruiz's nose, a simple gesture of human care amidst the monstrous reality of their confinement. Knowing that every single second he spent tending to the details was 1 second closer to the possibility of rescue, or the certainty of annihilation. A static shriek suddenly cut through the heavy silence. RTO Specialist Miller, hunkered down 50 yards back behind a massive, root-laden banyan, was talking into the radio handset, his voice distorted and urgent. Callahan could only hear snippets. Negative on the dust-off, LZ looks hot. Repeat, LZ is hot. 5 by 5, over. The words were like psychological shrapnel. LZ hot meant the VC had zeroed in on their potential extraction point. Negative on the dust-off ETA meant the promised 15 minutes was likely a pipe dream, stretched into an indeterminate, torturous wait. Callahan's stomach clenched. The only thing worse than knowing the enemy was waiting was knowing that the rescue might never come. He looked desperately toward the banyan, wanting to sprint to Miller for a clear update, but the open ground separating them was suicide territory. He was tethered to the crater and his patience. The radio chatter faded as Miller shifted frequency, leaving them once more suspended in the suffocating quiet. 10 minutes remaining, or perhaps an hour. The ambiguity was crushing. Callahan felt a cold sweat break out despite the heat. He reached into his aid bag, pulling out the last bag of lactated ringers. Ruiz was showing classic signs of hypovolemic shock, regardless of the chest stabilization. He needed fluids, and he needed them fast. The bag, barely a liter, felt woefully inadequate. As he inserted the 4-line into Ruiz's arm, he noticed the sudden increase in insect activity. A cloud of biting gnats had descended, drawn by the scent of the wounds. He swatted them away frantically, the movement feeling clumsy and loud, paranoid that the minute disturbance would be enough to draw the attention of the unseen observer. He realized the jungle itself was turning against them. The heat, the insects, the impenetrable foliage, all conspiring to maximize the difficulty of the wait. He focused on the drip count of the 4, tried to establish a steady flow, a small, controllable rhythm in the midst of the uncontrollable. Vance's eyes were closed now, the morphine settling in. Callahan had a moment of intense fear. Had he given too much? Was the sergeant slipping into unconsciousness? He quickly checked Vance's airway, leaning close, smelling the metallic tang of dried blood on his breath. Vance opened one eye, recognizing the panic in Callahan's movement. Still here, document. Just resting my eyes. Listen to the wind. It shifted. Hear it. Callahan listened, straining. The wind had indeed shifted, a slight breeze that carried the scent of rain, but more ominously, the faint smell of burning wood and stale tobacco. The signature smell of a nearby NVA fire pit, now extinguished but still detectable. The threat was not just distant, it was immediately surrounding them. The necessity of action finally superseded the paranoia of waiting. Ruiz was entering a critical phase of shock, and the fluid volume, even with the 4, wasn't enough. Callahan had to administer a large volume colloid solution, a desperate measure. He needed to be hyper-focused to block out the oppressive jungle and the unseen enemy and perform pure clinical medicine. He pulled out the thick, viscous plasma expander. The administration was tricky and required him to position himself higher up on the lip of the crater for better leverage, exposing his back slightly. He moved with agonizing slowness, his every muscle screaming in protest at the necessary vulnerability. He inserted the larger gauge needle for the colloid infusion, the sticky fluid pooling slightly before it began its slow drip. As he worked, he spoke softly to Ruiz, keeping his voice steady, reciting the procedures as if giving a lecture in a sterile ward, a desperate anchor to normalcy. We're getting this fluid in, kid. It's going to raise your blood pressure. You just got to keep breathing for me. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and hated the way the sun beat down directly onto the exposed plastic of the 4 bag, making him worry about heat degradation. 9 minutes remained, according to his last estimate, but the time felt entirely arbitrary now. It felt like they had been trapped for hours. The waiting had become a form of sensory deprivation mixed with sensory overload. He could feel the eyes on him, tracking his movements from the dense shadows of the banyan tree line. He risked a quick, calculated scan of the jungle perimeter. Nothing. No movement. Just the green, suffocating wall of foliage that concealed both life and death. He realized the silence was worse than the shooting. The active combat had been a release, a moment of focused engagement. The wait was pure psychological torture, designed to erode certainty and introduce fatal flaws into movement. He finished securing the colloid line, his immediate task complete. He then shifted his gaze back to Vance, whose breathing was too shallow now, too quiet. The sergeant was fading rapidly, the trauma of the spinal injury finally overwhelming the temporary benefits of the morphine. Callahan knew he couldn't let Vance slip into full unconsciousness. He needed to monitor him, if only for the sake of the man's dignity. He gently touched Vance's shoulder, a nonverbal check-in. The sergeant's eyes fluttered open, dark and exhausted. The true deadly burden of the wait was not the enemy's impending attack, but the excruciating responsibility of watching life ebb away, minute by minute, while being powerless to accelerate the only thing that could save them, the passage of time. The jungle offered no sanctuary, only concealment for the enemy. Callahan, now slightly elevated near the crater rim to monitor the infusion lines, scanned the heavy concentration of roots and shadows surrounding the banyan tree, the natural command post for an observation team. His paranoia, honed by the deadly weight, was spiking. He saw it, or thought he did, a subtle misalignment of the dense ferns, perhaps 50 yards out, near where the ground rose sharply toward the ridge. It wasn't movement. It was a lack of movement, a stillness that was unnatural in the perpetually shifting jungle environment. He focused, squinting through the heat shimmer. There, beneath a fan of overlapping leaves, was a faint, almost invisible glint. Sunlight catching the edge of something polished, a rifle scope or a helmet rim. The knowledge that he was being sighted, that an enemy soldier was calmly waiting, perhaps resting a finger on a trigger, aiming directly at the most exposed point of the crater, flooded him with cold rage and terror. He did not dare lift his rifle. A single shot from his M16 would not only confirm their exact position, but would likely draw immediate, sustained mortar fire, a tactic the NVA excelled at. He had to absorb the gaze, to remain a static target while ensuring the vital lines into his patients remained secure. Vance sensed the shift in Callahan's focus. His breathing ragged, he whispered, "What is it, Doc? Don't move." Callahan didn't answer, his eyes locked on the faint glint. The psychological pressure was unbearable. The unseen sniper was the ultimate expression of the deadly weight. They controlled the flow of time and fire. Callahan felt a desperate need to communicate the threat, but without making a sound. He subtly pointed his chin toward the banyan area, hoping Vance would understand. Vance, showing a burst of adrenaline-fueled clarity, tracked the direction, his jaw setting grimly. "Wait for the birds. They'll flush him," Vance muttered, his voice barely audible over the insect buzz. The advice was sound, tactically correct. Use the chaos of the extraction to cover the necessary defensive fire. But waiting meant enduring the constant possibility of a sudden, fatal shot. 7 minutes left on the clock, assuming the RTO's earlier, now doubtful estimate. The weight was dissolving Callahan's capacity for clear thought, replacing it with pure, reactive instinct. He checked the bandages on Ruiz, finding a new bleed starting on his forearm, a minor complication, but a devastating psychological blow. Every time he solved one problem, the environment or the physiological breakdown introduced another. The tension of holding still, of resisting the urge to snap and fire into the shadows, was almost physical. He pressed his palms into the mud, anchoring himself, forcing his heart rate down. He was a statue of forced patience, a medic trapped in the crosshairs, trying to save 2 lives that depended entirely on his capacity to withstand the psychological assault of the jungle silence. The pressure in the air changed again, but this time the disruption was welcome, even terrifying. A distant, rhythmic thump, 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 vibrating through the ground. It was the sound of salvation and immediate, extreme danger, the incoming Huey. The sound was still miles off, muffled by the mountains, but its arrival shattered the long, agonizing silence. The deadly weight was nearing its climax, transitioning from psychological suspense to physical combat. The NVA would be fully aware of the approaching birds. The moment the chopper committed to the landing zone, the jungle would erupt. Callahan grabbed his radio handset, pressing the transmit button with a trembling thumb. "Miller, this is document. We have 2 critical. Need vector guidance now. Confirm hostile fire possibility on LZ." Miller's static-laced reply was clipped and sharp. "LZ is still contested, Doc. Incoming fire confirmed. Birds are 5 mics out, holding orbit at 900 feet. 5 minutes." The silent suspense was instantly replaced by hypervigilance. Callahan had to prepare his patients for rapid extraction under fire. He quickly checked the splints on Vance, ensuring he was as rigid as possible, and checked Ruiz's chest seal and 4-line one last time. He had to be ready to drag both men across 50 yards of exposed mud and broken earth to the nearest clear spot, the makeshift LZ near the banyan. He shoved all his remaining medical gear into his pack, preparing for the inevitable sprint. "Sarge, listen to me. When the bird is on final, we move. I drag Ruiz first. You use your arms to push off the ground. We have maybe 30 seconds of cover before they start raining rounds on us. Vance nodded grimly, his face reflecting the shared dread of the transition. The wait had been agonizing, but the sudden, violent activity was even more terrifying because it was the moment of ultimate exposure. The sound of the rotors grew rapidly, no longer distant but a deep, vibrating tremor in the chest. 3 minutes. The noise was now loud enough to drown out the immediate jungle sounds, providing a momentary shield against the paranoia of the unseen sniper, but also serving as a massive beacon, drawing all surrounding fire. Callahan checked his M16 again, pushing a fresh magazine home. He was a medic, but in these final critical moments, he was also the only defensive line protecting his patients. The noise was deafening now, a tearing, whipping sound as the Huey dropped into the valley, its engine straining against the altitude and the heavy humidity. The chopper was circling, hovering, unwilling to commit fully to the hot LZ. 2 minutes. The moment the pilot paused, the jungle erupted, not with sustained automatic fire, but with the hollow, terrifying thunk, thunk, thunk of mortar tubes cycling. 3 rounds dropped rapidly, impacting 50 yards away near the banyan, sending plumes of black smoke and earth into the sky. The VC had held their fire, waiting patiently, and now they were delivering the promised hell. Callahan instinctively flattened himself over Ruiz, shielding him with his body. The ground shook violently with each impact. Shrapnel whizzed overhead, sounding like angry bees. Vance cried out, not from a fresh wound, but from the searing realization that they were running out of time and cover. The Huey, seeing the immediate mortar barrage, suddenly banked hard, pulling up and away, a wave off. They're leaving. Vance roared over the rotor wash. The extraction was aborting. Callahan felt a sickening wave of despair. The deadly weight had just been reset, potentially for another agonizing hour, but this time, the enemy knew exactly where they were and were actively shelling the area. He grabbed the radio. Dust off. You have to commit. We are taking incoming. We have 2 critical. The pilot's voice, cold and professional, cut through the static. Negative ground 0. Too hot. We'll hold position and try in 10 mics. Secure the LZ. Over and out. 10 more minutes of absolute hell under concentrated mortar fire. The psychological torture of the wait had been replaced by the physical devastation of incoming fire. Callahan knew Ruiz and Vance couldn't survive another 10 minutes of this bombardment. The mortar rounds were walking closer, impacting now within 30 yards. The earth vibrated, showering them with dirt and hot debris. Callahan had to get them out of the crater. It was too shallow, offering no protection from overhead fragmentation. He looked at Ruiz, pale and fading, and then at Vance, whose face was a mask of furious determination. We're moving now, not to the LZ, just away from here. The plan changed instantly. Survival demanded improvisation. Callahan used the momentary lull between mortar bursts, a precious few seconds, to execute his improvised escape plan. He snapped the 4-line from Ruiz, knowing the risks of sudden shock were outweighed by the certainty of fragmentation wounds. He secured Ruiz's pack straps around his own shoulder, gripping the rifle in his dominant hand. Vance push. Ruiz hold tight. He dragged Ruiz backward, low to the ground, scrambling out of the crater. The mud was thick, clinging to their bodies, slowing their desperate panic crawl. Vance, using his arms, pushed himself forward, dragging his paralyzed lower half through the muck, keeping agonizingly close to Callahan's heels. They moved toward a massive, exposed root system 50 feet away, hoping it offered a slightly better shield from the overhead fire. As they moved, the jungle exploded again, a near miss, maybe 15 feet behind the crater. The force of the concussion threw Callahan forward, his ears ringing violently. He checked Ruiz, whose eyes were wide with terror, but otherwise stable. Vance, cursing through grit teeth, had maintained his momentum. They reached the root structure, crawling beneath the gnarled tangle of wood that offered a minimal roof of protection. It was still a weight, but a moving weight, a desperate sprint against time. The mortar rounds continued to fall sporadically, but the heavy tree cover was deflecting the worst of the shrapnel. 7 minutes until the Huey returned. The weight had shifted from quiet, psychological terror to kinetic, desperate survival. Callahan pulled out his last field dressing, quickly applying pressure to a new shrapnel cut on Vance's arm. A minor wound, but a constant reminder of their exposure. He looked back at the bomb crater, now utterly obliterated by the accurate mortar fire. The stillness of the silent weight had been a deceit. The enemy was never gone, just repositioning. Callahan checked his watch, his heart hammering against his ribs. The duality of his experience was complete. The unbearable silence followed by the unbearable noise. He preferred the noise, at least it was honest. In the next few minutes, he knew the VC would close in, attempting to finish the job before the helicopter returned. They had survived the silent wait, but the final, violent confrontation was still pending. The final moments were pure, desperate chaos. The thump, thump, thump of the returning Huey was now directly overhead, creating a powerful downwash that shredded the remaining canopy and sent mud flying. The pilot, ignoring the ongoing fire, had committed. "Dust-off is on the ground. Go, go, go," Miller screamed over the radio. Callahan knew this was their absolute final chance. He heaved Ruiz onto his back, clutching the M16. The jungle erupted with small arms fire, the VC sprinting to capitalize on the chopper's vulnerability. Tracers zipped past, illuminating the dust-filled air. Callahan bolted, running with the impossible weight of Ruiz, dragging Vance by his harness with his free hand. 50 yards of absolute exposure, the ground slick with blood and mud. He heard the telltale crack of high-velocity rounds hitting the metal fuselage of the Huey. He reached the open LZ, a small clearing carved by the initial skirmish. The chopper crew chief was screaming, leaning out, laying down, suppressing fire. "Move it, Doc. Move it." Callahan shoved Ruiz into the open cargo bay, the effort nearly collapsing him. He turned for Vance, who had stopped, frozen by the sight of the chaos. Just as Callahan reached for him, the world exploded in front of them. A volley of RPG fire streaked over the clearing, missing the Huey by feet, but impacting violently 50 yards past, signaling the absolute commitment of the NVA to kill the extraction. The crew chief hauled Vance up and over the skid just as Callahan launched himself onto the deck, collapsing next to his patients. The Huey didn't wait for final clearance. It wrenched itself skyward, pitching violently. Callahan stared out the open hatch, looking down at the silent, steaming jungle of Hill 900. The noise of the machine guns, the rotors, and the screams faded as they climbed. He checked Ruiz and Vance, both alive, stabilized. The 15 minutes of deadly wait had stretched into 45 minutes of perpetual terror, shifting brutally between suffocating silence and shattering noise. As the Huey banked, carrying them toward the safety of the base, Callahan finally allowed himself to breathe. He looked at his shaking hands, covered in the evidence of his struggle. The physical exhaustion was overwhelming, but the lingering memory was not the sound of the mortar rounds, but the paralyzing, endless silence of the wait, the time when fear was the most potent enemy of all.